question you've probably never asked yourself directly but that you answer every single day through your choices, your reactions, and the stories you tell about who you are. That question is whether your past is a weight you carry or a map you consult, whether the experiences that shaped you are primarily constraints on who you can become or resources for navigating who you're becoming. The answer isn't binary, and that's precisely what makes this so psychologically complex. Your past is both anchor and compass, both prison and library, and understanding when it's serving you versus when it's limiting you might be one of the most important distinctions you can make in the project of building a life that feels authentic and forward-moving rather than endlessly reactive to old wounds and outdated stories. Let's start with what psychologists know about how memory actually works, because the past you think you're carrying around isn't quite what you think it is. Memory is not a video recording that you play back with perfect fidelity. It's a reconstruction that happens in the present moment, influenced by your current emotional state, your beliefs about yourself, and what you need the memory to mean right now. Every time you recall a memory, you're subtly changing it, updating it with new context and current interpretations. The fight you had with your father when you were 15 exists in your mind not as a fixed historical fact but as a story that's been edited and re-edited dozens or hundreds of times, each telling shaped by your evolving understanding of yourself, your father, and what that moment meant. This is why siblings can have radically different memories of the same childhood event. They're not lying or delusional, they're accessing different reconstructions based on different needs and different narrative frameworks. When you say your past is holding you back, what you often mean is that your current interpretation of your past is holding you back, and that's a crucial distinction because interpretations can be revised in ways that historical facts cannot. The concept of psychological baggage that dominates popular therapy culture suggests that we accumulate wounds and traumas that we must unpack and process before we can move forward. There's truth in this framework. Unprocessed trauma genuinely does constrain behavior and limit possibility in ways that therapeutic work can address. But this metaphor of baggage also creates a problematic relationship with the past, as if your history is primarily composed of things you need to get rid of, weight you need to shed before you can be free. An alternative framework, one that's equally supported by psychological research, is that your past is more like a toolkit than a burden. Every difficult experience you've survived has taught you something about resilience, about what you're capable of enduring, about strategies for coping with adversity. Every relationship that ended badly has given you information about what you need from relationships and what patterns to avoid. Every failure has refined your understanding of your limits and your learning edges. The question isn't whether to carry your past or leave it behind. That's impossible. Your past is literally encoded in your neural pathways and implicit memories. The question is whether you're using your past as data for better decision-making or as evidence for limiting beliefs about what's possible for you. There's fascinating research on something called post-traumatic growth, which challenges the assumption that trauma only damages people. While trauma absolutely can create lasting psychological harm, a significant percentage of people who experience traumatic events report positive changes that emerged from the experience. They develop deeper relationships, discover inner strength they didn't know they had, find new meaning or purpose, develop greater appreciation for life, or experience spiritual or philosophical growth. This doesn't mean trauma is good or that suffering is necessary for growth. That's a dangerous romanticization. But it does mean that even the worst experiences in your past can become sources of wisdom, compassion, and strength if you can metabolize them in certain ways. The difference between people for whom trauma becomes primarily a wound versus those for whom it becomes also a source of growth often comes down to narrative, the story you construct about what the trauma means about you and your capacity to handle difficulty. The challenge with using your past as a guide is that you need enough distance from it to extract the lessons without being overwhelmed by the emotions. When you're still in the middle of processing a painful experience, when the wound is fresh and the emotions are raw, your past is more likely to overwhelm you than guide you. This is why people often say that they couldn't see what a relationship or job or life phase taught them until years later. They needed time to develop perspective, to let the intensity of the emotions fade enough that they could think about the experience rather than just feel it. The past guides most effectively when you can approach it with what Buddhists call beginner's mind, a kind of curious openness to what you might learn rather than a fixed interpretation of what it all meant. When you decide once and for all that your childhood trauma means you're broken, or that your past successes mean you're special, you've closed off the possibility of discovering new meanings and lessons that might serve you better. There's a particular way the past holds people back that's worth examining closely, which is through the mechanism of identity. You develop a story about who you are based largely on your past experiences, and then you behave in ways that confirm that story because humans have a powerful need for consistency. If your story is that you're someone who always gets rejected, you'll unconsciously create situations that confirm that identity. If your story is that you're not smart enough for certain opportunities, you won't pursue those opportunities and you'll interpret any difficulties as confirmation of your inadequacy. The past holds you back not through the actual events but through the identity you've constructed from those events and your commitment to maintaining that identity even when it limits you. What makes this particularly insidious is that these identities often form during childhood when your brain was still developing and your capacity for complex thinking was limited, yet you carry them into adulthood as if they're objective truths about who you are rather than stories a child told to make sense of confusing experiences. The therapeutic concept of reparenting yourself speaks to this dynamic. You can't change what happened to you, but you can change your relationship to what happened by essentially becoming a wiser, more compassionate parent to the parts of yourself that are still operating from old wounds and limited childhood understanding. When you notice yourself reacting to a current situation based on past trauma, when you feel yourself falling into old patterns that no longer serve you, you can pause and ask what the younger version of you who developed this pattern needed and didn't get. Then you can provide that, whether it's reassurance, permission, protection, or simply acknowledgement of the pain. This isn't about dwelling in the past. It's about updating your past by bringing adult wisdom and compassion to experiences that you originally processed with a child's limited toolkit. The flip side of being held back by your past is being so determined to escape it that you can't learn from it. There are people who refuse to look backward at all, who insist they're only focused on the future, who treat their history as something to be transcended rather than integrated. This approach might seem psychologically healthy, all that forward momentum, no dwelling on old wounds, but it often leads to repeating the same patterns in new contexts because you haven't actually processed what your past is trying to teach you. The person who jumps from relationship to relationship without ever examining why their relationships keep failing in similar ways. The person who changes jobs constantly without recognizing that the problem might be their own patterns rather than bad luck with employers. The person who cuts off family members without doing the work to understand the dynamics that created the rift. Moving forward without learning from your past isn't growth, it's just motion, and motion can create the illusion of progress while you're actually running in circles. One of the most powerful questions you can ask about any experience in your past is not, "Why did this happen to me?" which often leads to victim narratives or self-blame, but rather, "What did this experience teach me?" or "How can I use what I learned from this experience?" These questions shift your relationship with the past from passive victim of circumstances to active learner extracting value from difficulty. They don't deny that bad things happened or that you were genuinely hurt, but they refuse to let that be the end of the story. The parent who was critical and withholding taught you something about the kind of parent you want to be, or about the need to develop internal validation rather than depending on external approval. The job you got fired from taught you something about organizational politics, or about the importance of fit between your values and workplace culture, or about your own areas for growth. The friendship that ended painfully taught you something about boundaries, or about recognizing red flags earlier, or about your own capacity to survive loss. There's research suggesting that people who can find meaning in their suffering experience better mental health outcomes than those who can't, but here's the nuance that matters: the meaning has to be authentic to your experience, not imposed from outside. When someone tells you that everything happens for a reason or that your trauma was a gift, they're trying to impose their meaning-making framework onto your experience, and that rarely helps. But when you discover your own meaning, when you find genuine lessons or growth that emerged from difficulty, that's different. That's you exercising agency over your narrative, choosing what your past means rather than letting it mean whatever your fear or shame or anger says it means. The tension between honoring your past and not being limited by it requires a kind of psychological flexibility that doesn't come naturally to most people. You need to be able to acknowledge that yes, these things happened, They shaped you in real ways, they created genuine wounds that require tending, and you need to simultaneously hold that those past experiences don't determine your future unless you let them. This isn't positive thinking or denying reality, it's recognizing that the past provides constraints and possibilities, that it narrows some pathways while opening others, and that you have more agency than you probably realize in choosing which pathways to focus on. The adult child of alcoholics has insights into addiction and family dysfunction that someone from a stable background might lack. The person who experienced poverty understands financial precarity in ways that create both anxiety and resourcefulness. The person who was bullied understands social cruelty but might also develop unusual empathy or advocacy skills. Every past contains both limitations and resources, and maturity involves getting better at recognizing and utilizing the resources while working to not be completely controlled by the limitations. What I've come to believe is that your past is doing both, holding you and guiding you, and the work is figuring out when to push against the holding and when to trust the guiding. When you feel yourself avoiding risks because of old failures, that's probably your past holding you back in ways worth challenging. When you feel yourself drawn to the same dysfunctional relationship patterns, that's your past guiding you toward familiar pain, and you need to override that guidance with conscious choice. But when your past whispers warnings based on genuine pattern recognition, when it offers hard-won wisdom about your own limits and needs, when it provides context that helps you understand your reactions and make better choices, that's your past serving you well. The goal isn't to be free of your past, that's impossible and probably not even desirable. The goal is to have a relationship with your past that's conscious rather than automatic, chosen rather than compulsive, one where you're the author of the meaning your experiences carry rather than a passive carrier of wounds you never chose to receive.